So, Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, has finally broken her highly characteristic, heavily guarded silence. And honestly, the absolute most mind-blowing, utterly devastating thing isn't simply that she chose to speak publicly. It is exactly what she explicitly revealed about a massive, highly secretive, and incredibly manipulative constitutional condition that King Charles desperately, aggressively tried to lock firmly into place entirely before Prince William's upcoming coronation could even be officially scheduled on the royal calendar. We are absolutely not talking about a petty, standard palace disagreement over the seating chart, who gets to wear which tiara, or who physically gets to stand where on the famous Buckingham Palace balcony. This was a highly classified, legally binding, aggressively written demand, explicitly insisting that William absolutely had to sign a formal document guaranteeing Sophie a permanent, unshakable seat on the absolute highest level of the sovereign's inner council, and if he refused, the entire, massive coronation timetable would just immediately, aggressively stall. And Sophie's incredibly explosive, highly damaging admission absolutely didn't come through some vague, leaky palace memo or a whispered, anonymous source to a friendly tabloid journalist. It happened directly, explicitly, at a private, heavily attended reception at St. James's Palace, and it was documented, fully confirmed, and emotionally heavy enough that she openly, shockingly admitted she felt absolute, suffocating dread, not relief or gratitude, when she initially learned exactly what Charles had aggressively done behind closed doors. Because, honestly, imagine for a second being explicitly told you are so incredibly valued, so absolutely crucial to the family's survival, that the reigning king is completely willing to deliberately, legally delay his own son's sacred crownings just to protect you, but that aggressive, heavy-handed protection instantly, violently makes you the exact, highly toxic reason the father and son are now staring at each other across a massively widening, incredibly dangerous generational gap. That is exactly where this entire, incredibly complex story lives, in that deeply uncomfortable, highly painful space exactly between being genuinely honored for years of loyal service and being brutally, manipulatively used as a massive constitutional test of a future king's ultimate submission. Before we get into the absolute full, deep dive breakdown of exactly how this highly explosive condition came to be drafted and what it actually, practically meant for the future of the British monarchy, take a quick second to hit that subscribe button for Create Pakistan so you absolutely never miss these intense, highly detailed royal deep dives. Alright, so, the absolute, unyielding core of this entire massive dispute is something officially called the Coronation Continuity Accord. That is the highly formal, official name of the specific, legally styled document that Charles personally, aggressively drafted, and incredibly, it already fully bore his own royal signature right at the bottom, leaving William's designated line entirely, glaringly blank. This accord wasn't just a friendly, gentle suggestion or a casual, entirely verbal understanding between family members. It was a highly formal, legal-style agreement that directly, explicitly, linked the entire progression of the coronation schedule to Sophie's legally guaranteed, permanent role on the inner council, which is that incredibly small, highly elite circle of senior advisors who possess direct, unfiltered access to the monarch during severe national emergencies or massive, highly sensitive family crises. Charles's specific logic, according to Sophie's own incredibly tense recollection, was that absolute continuity required having someone intimately close who was entirely willing to speak the absolute brutal truth when diplomatic silence felt vastly safer, and he firmly, absolutely believed she was exactly that indispensable person. The massive, undeniable problem is that by aggressively making it a non-negotiable pre-coronation condition, he instantly, forcefully put Sophie in an incredibly toxic position where absolutely every single professional advantage the document legally gave her instantly made her look exactly like she was actively, aggressively standing directly between William and his rightful succession to the crown. She explicitly, clearly stated herself that she absolutely never, ever asked Charles to aggressively impose this specific mandate. She hadn't quietly campaigned for a permanent council seat or demanded any kind of historical reward. But once that formal, highly contentious condition officially existed on paper, her entire royal future wasn't actually about her loyal service anymore. It was instantly transformed into a massive, highly dangerous bargaining chip actively weaponized between a sick father who deeply feared his son would aggressively, ruthlessly erase all the accumulated experience from the previous reign, and a proud, highly independent son who deeply feared his absolute first, defining act, as the new king would be publicly, humiliatingly obeying a strict, unyielding command written entirely by someone else. So that is exactly where the entire dynamic gets incredibly deeply weird, because Prince William's immediate visceral reaction wasn't an explosive, highly public screaming fit of furious rage. When he was first handed the incredibly thick, highly classified briefing folder and fully understood exactly what Charles was aggressively demanding, he simply, quietly closed the heavy cover entirely before even reaching the final, signed page, while Catherine stood silently nearby, watching him intentionally, coldly withdraw into himself, rather than loudly, dramatically erupt. Sophie later intimately understood that William absolutely wasn't aggressively angry that she had spoken up or had opinions. He was deeply, profoundly wounded that Charles actually, genuinely believed he explicitly needed to be legally, forcefully cornered into honoring her years of service. That specific emotional distinction matters immensely. If William had simply been acting as a stubborn, power-hungry, incredibly arrogant heir, this would be a much simpler, incredibly boring story. But he was genuinely, deeply hurt. He truly, actively respected Sophie, but he just fundamentally, absolutely believed that his very first, highly defining act as the supreme sovereign simply had to demonstrably, undeniably prove his absolute independence, and actively, publicly signing a highly restrictive document that arrived with his father's commanding signature already aggressively in place, felt significantly less like protecting continuity, and vastly more like being forced to begin his entire reign completely trapped beneath another man's lingering, heavy shadow. Meanwhile, King Charles was reportedly sitting completely alone in his quiet study, literally spreading Sophie's incredibly detailed, years-long engagement records and private correspondence across his massive desk, actively, physically circling specific, highly tense moments where she had quietly, brilliantly, prevented massive, deeply damaging family tensions from exploding into highly public, irreversible media crises. He explicitly told a highly trusted, deeply loyal senior aide that while William completely, flawlessly understood the rigid structure of duty and absolute constitutional limits, the younger prince might severely, dangerously underestimate the massive, long-term emotional cost of aggressively removing the exact people who truly knew how to speak honestly, when absolutely everyone else simply stayed terrified and completely silent. So, both incredibly powerful men possessed entirely valid, deeply held fears, but the massive, entirely unavoidable tragedy is that those deeply personal fears became completely, structurally incompatible the exact, precise moment they were formalized, weaponized, and legally drafted into a binding constitutional document. But the actual, deeply complicated timeline of this entire massive conflict actually starts exactly months before the highly controversial coronation condition was even formally drafted, beginning during a highly tense, deeply scrutinized Commonwealth Service planning meeting held deep inside Buckingham Palace. The massive Commonwealth Service is that incredibly important, highly symbolic annual ceremony specifically honoring the various nations deeply connected through the Commonwealth, and absolutely every single physical position, seating arrangement, and explicit mention in its highly choreographed procession carries immense, undeniable symbolic weight. Sophie suddenly, sharply noticed that several incredibly loyal, long-serving representatives, people whom the late Queen Elizabeth II had personally, explicitly, and highly publicly promised would be formally recognized at the absolute next major service, had been quietly, aggressively, and entirely removed from the official order of service. Their names were just completely, inexplicably gone. William had officially, directly approved a significantly shorter, highly streamlined procession, specifically to modernize the incredibly lengthy event and actively prevent long delays, which he genuinely, firmly saw as a highly practical, entirely necessary administrative decision, absolutely not a cruel, vindictive, or deeply personal one. Sophie, however, saw it completely, radically differently. She firmly, aggressively placed the newly revised, heavily edited order of service directly in front of Charles, physically pointed to the glaring, incredibly disrespectful empty spaces, and explicitly, directly asked whether raw, cold administrative efficiency now suddenly mattered vastly more than a beloved sovereign's sacred, unbreakable word. The king slowly, incredibly carefully, read the specific page once, then intensely read it again, while William was standing right there in the incredibly tense room, already deeply sensing that this incredibly sharp, highly pointed question was explicitly, aggressively aimed at vastly more than just the simple ceremony schedule. He quickly, firmly told Sophie that incredibly massive, sweeping coronation-era decisions simply couldn't be constantly, endlessly reopened every single time they carried a bit of emotional, deeply nostalgic history. She instantly, coldly answered without a single second of hesitation that exact, specific history was exactly, perfectly, what gave those massive decisions their true, undeniable meaning, and then she aggressively, surprisingly, removed her own highly prominent name from the prestigious procession list entirely, and explicitly, proudly offered her highly coveted place to one of the unfairly excluded representatives, explicitly stating that she absolutely would not accept a massive public honor from a ceremony fundamentally built directly on a broken, forgotten promise. Charles silently, carefully waited until an incredibly frustrated William finally left the incredibly tense room, and then slowly opened a highly secure private desk drawer. Inside was a fragile handwritten note directly from the late Queen Elizabeth II, completely, explicitly confirming exactly what Sophie had perfectly remembered, that those specific representatives were absolutely, unquestionably supposed to be formally, publicly recognized. The incredibly arrogant, highly modernized palace machinery had casually, ruthlessly, allowed that incredibly sacred promise to simply disappear, and Sophie was the absolute, only person who would completely, stubbornly refuse to let it go. That exact, specific evening, an incredibly moved Charles explicitly instructed his senior private secretary to immediately begin drafting a massive, highly protective legal mandate for her future, permanent role, firmly deciding that he was absolutely not going to let her incredibly rare honesty become the exact, specific reason she was aggressively removed from the highly restricted decision-making circle. But William completely, inevitably later discovered exactly where and why the highly controversial condition had originally begun, and when he finally, aggressively entered the room carrying the entirely unsigned, highly contentious accord, the massive, boiling argument was absolutely no longer about one single, simple ceremony. It was entirely, fundamentally about whether Sophie had actively, aggressively helped Charles explicitly question his own son's ultimate, fundamental fitness to rule. That is the exact, explosive moment the entire conflict completely stopped being about a simple council seat and became entirely, violently about absolute, unbreakable trust at the most fundamental, deeply personal level. So, according to the latest, breathless barrage of royal headlines, William absolutely didn't coldly summon Sophie through a junior aide when he intensely wanted to confront her. He personally, physically, carried the heavy, unsigned accord directly to her himself, with absolutely no private secretaries, no nervous courtiers, just the two of them, entirely alone, in a small, quiet sitting room at Windsor, with the heavy oak door firmly closed by his own hand. He firmly, aggressively placed the highly controversial document directly on the table and explicitly, pointedly, asked the exact, highly uncomfortable question Sophie had deeply feared from the very beginning. Had she actively, willingly, allowed Charles to completely weaponize her incredible loyalty into a massive, highly manipulative test of his own son's true readiness for the heavy crown? She absolutely didn't retreat or cower. She openly, honestly admitted that Charles had indeed discussed actively protecting her future access, but she firmly, sincerely swore she had absolutely never known he fully intended to connect that aggressive protection directly to the actual coronation ceremony itself. She looked William directly in the eyes and firmly, absolutely told him she would never, ever have accepted any role that forcefully, publicly made him choose between his sick father's unyielding command and his own absolute, undeniable sovereign authority. Then, she slowly reached completely across the table, took the heavy document, and explicitly, physically pointed to one highly specific sentence, written directly by Charles himself. Continuity requires someone willing to speak, when affection makes silence easier. That absolutely wasn't a gentle, loving, fatherly message. It was a massive, incredibly blunt, highly aggressive warning, and Sophie instantly followed it, with the exact, incredibly difficult question William had been desperately, heavily hoping to completely avoid. She directly asked whether he had truly, honestly ever intended to preserve her highly respected place, or whether he had actively, secretly planned to completely, ruthlessly remove Charles's entire inner circle as soon as the absolute accession was complete. William, finally, heavily admitted the completely undeniable truth. His incredibly early, highly classified restructuring proposal would have entirely, completely dissolved the existing, heavily entrenched family council and aggressively replaced it with a significantly smaller, highly streamlined group built entirely, exclusively around himself, Catherine, and a group of highly professional, entirely unfeeling constitutional staff. Sophie instantly, completely understood the massive, incredibly terrifying implication. Charles had clearly, undeniably seen that highly secret, deeply classified proposal entirely before writing the aggressive condition, meaning absolutely someone deeply embedded inside William's own highly trusted inner circle had deliberately, secretly placed it directly into the king's hands. That highly trusted someone was Catherine. She had secretly, quietly, found Sophie's name entirely, glaringly missing from the massive future advisory structure, and deeply, truly believed William was moving incredibly, dangerously too quickly to entirely, aggressively separate his new reign from his father's established household. She deeply, truly feared he would drastically mistake cold, brutal distance for absolute strength, and deeply, horribly regret entirely losing the absolute one person who was entirely willing to constantly challenge him without desperately seeking a personal reward. So, she explicitly, secretly, transferred the highly classified proposal directly to Charles herself, and later tearfully, heavily admitted it to Sophie, while sitting directly beside William's completely unopened coronation box. Her hands stayed tightly folded, but her voice completely, noticeably broke, as she desperately explained that successfully protecting her husband's incredibly important future had tragically, horribly required, actively, secretly betraying his absolute, deep confidence. Sophie physically, intensely felt the incredibly deep wound immediately, explicitly stating she had absolutely never, ever asked Catherine to actively, secretly intervene for her, and she heavily, intensely warned that massive aggressive protection built entirely through hidden, deeply secret decisions could incredibly easily become massive, toxic manipulation, even when the underlying intention was pure, unadulterated love. Catherine quietly, heavily accepted the incredibly sharp rebuke, but she also deeply, truly knew that absolute silence would have entirely allowed William to ruthlessly cut away years of incredible experience he might very soon desperately, incredibly deeply need. When an incredibly shocked William finally learned the full, devastating truth, he quietly asked Catherine whether she genuinely, truly believed he was completely, utterly incapable of properly choosing his own senior advisors. He absolutely didn't shout, which made the incredibly quiet question vastly more painful and entirely devastating. She softly, firmly answered that she deeply believed he was absolutely capable, but she also truly knew he was incredibly angry, massively rushed, and intensely, aggressively determined to prove his absolute independence, completely, before anyone had actually, truly challenged whether that independence was truly at risk. That is an incredibly devastatingly accurate, entirely brilliant read of the highly tense situation, and it perfectly explains exactly why this massive, deeply complex conflict absolutely couldn't be resolved by simply, easily signing or violently refusing to sign a piece of paper. The document had entirely, undeniably become a massive, incredibly heavy symbol of something vastly larger. Whether William's highly anticipated reign would ultimately begin as completely his own, or simply as a heavily controlled, highly anxious extension of his father's deepest, darkest fears. The highly practical, entirely devastating consequences started rapidly, aggressively piling up incredibly fast, because a massive, globally televised coronation absolutely depends on absolute, unyielding certainty. Absolutely every single carriage movement, ancient oath, specific signature, military formation, and highly choreographed broadcast cue has to be completely, unchangeably fixed, long before the massive crown is ever physically lifted. But William's heavily unsigned promise actively created a massive, entirely deafening silence exactly at the absolute center of all the frantic, massive preparations. The incredibly complex, massive rehearsals relentlessly continued, yet the final, absolutely necessary royal approval did entirely not come. The incredibly stressed, totally panicked staff entirely stopped asking whether the actual, specific timetable had changed, and quickly, terrifyingly, began asking whether the entire, highly protected royal family itself had totally, permanently fractured before the new reign had even officially, publicly begun. Charles, stubbornly, aggressively withheld the absolute sovereign's approval memorandum, which is the exact, specific monarch's highly formal, legally binding written permission, completely allowing the absolute last stage of massive global planning to proceed. Without it, highly stressed officials could continually, endlessly prepare, but they couldn't officially confirm absolutely anything. Highly important foreign guests, massive, heavily armed military units, global broadcasters, and deeply exhausted palace staff, absolutely all of them deeply, entirely depended on exactly one specific, unchangeable fixed date, and that date simply, infuriatingly couldn't be formally officially announced. Senior, highly ranked officials were strictly, quietly told to frantically continue massive, incredibly expensive rehearsals, while actively, entirely avoiding absolutely any kind of official public confirmation, which left them completely, suffocatingly trapped, directly between incredible, massive urgency and totally deafening, absolute silence, with every single delayed answer rapidly feeding massive suspicion and every heavily closed meeting making the incredibly deep division feel vastly more serious. Sophie quietly, tensely arrived for a highly scheduled briefing entirely during this massive, exhausting chaos, and immediately saw her own specific name physically printed directly beside the incredibly controversial new council position. She instantly, aggressively crossed it out heavily with a pen right in front of the highly stressed secretary and loudly, firmly declared that absolutely no rehearsal should ever carelessly treat the incredibly toxic condition as officially accepted completely before William had truly, entirely chosen freely. Edward reacted with immense, deeply visible frustration, aggressively telling her that actively, publicly, withdrawing now would only heavily reward the incredibly arrogant, heavily entrenched courtiers who viewed deeply dependable, highly loyal service as entirely, incredibly disposable. She quietly, firmly answered that remaining totally, cowardly silent would inevitably, absolutely make William deeply, truly believe she valued the incredibly powerful, highly coveted seat significantly more than his absolute unbreakable trust. That is exactly the incredibly loyal, highly principled Sophie that Charles had been desperately, aggressively trying to protect. The exact one who would completely, instantly, rather entirely, lose the highly powerful position than have it permanently, totally become a massive, highly toxic source of incredibly deep family division. But Edward absolutely wasn't entirely wrong either. Completely, utterly surrendering, could easily, ruthlessly, erase decades of absolute, incredible loyalty in exactly one single, highly impulsive decision. The incredibly panicked, totally overwhelmed Coronation Council, the massive, highly elite group entirely responsible for directly coordinating the massive ceremony, eventually, desperately demanded an absolute, completely final timetable, strictly within 48 highly stressful hours. Without it, entirely massive international delegations and huge military units would be formally, embarrassingly told that the massive preparations were under review, which is incredibly polite, terrifying diplomatic language for something is incredibly, horribly wrong. William intensely, aggressively ordered his highly stressed office to immediately, quietly prepare exactly two completely different, totally massive announcements. One explicitly, happily confirming the coronation, and the entirely other deeply, embarrassingly explaining its massive postponement directly because of entirely unresolved, highly sensitive transition arrangements. Before either incredibly massive, potentially world-shaking statement could possibly be released, Sophie quietly, intensely asked to meet him completely alone. She absolutely wasn't coming to aggressively, selfishly force his highly reluctant signature, but she was quietly, brilliantly, coming with an incredible, entirely unexpected solution Charles had absolutely never, ever even imagined. Sophie deliberately, incredibly carefully chose the incredibly private, highly secluded chapel at Windsor for this massive, incredibly important meeting, a very small, deeply quiet place of absolutely intense worship, strictly reserved exclusively for the royal household, completely far from all public ritual and massive formal business, with absolutely no heavy wooden desks, no massive files, and no highly classified briefing papers anywhere in sight. She quietly, intensely handed William a fully signed, completely legally binding personal declaration, explicitly, permanently renouncing absolutely any right she might ever have to aggressively enforce the highly controversial council guarantee, completely, after the actual coronation was completed. In incredibly simple, totally undeniable terms, she was explicitly, fully giving him the absolute, unyielding power to completely remove her entirely without any challenge. She looked directly at him and intensely, quietly told him she would absolutely rather lose every single future, highly coveted role than forcefully, aggressively enter his new, incredibly important reign as the living, walking symbol of Charles's aggressive, absolute control. William deeply, truly heard the incredible, immense pain perfectly hiding beneath her incredibly steady voice, and finally, totally understood that Sophie had absolutely never, ever wanted highly controversial, deeply resented authority, aggressively protected by pure force. His intense, completely blinding anger at Charles had incredibly tragically made him explicitly, unfairly treat her entirely as part of the toxic, highly manipulative condition, instead of the deeply loyal, entirely innocent person, completely trapped inside it. He quietly, entirely admitted he had incredibly unfairly judged her entirely, before simply asking what the incredibly heavy, deeply controversial promise was actually costing her. Sophie absolutely didn't use that incredibly rare, highly important confession to aggressively, intensely defend herself. She quietly, intensely told him that absolute loyalty became entirely, totally meaningless when it could literally only survive through highly aggressive, completely written protection. Her incredibly deep sadness came completely from entirely surrendering an incredibly heavy promise, explicitly intended to deeply honor years of totally flawless service, but she would completely, absolutely surrender it, rather than allow that specific honor to violently, terribly divide the entire family. William quietly, entirely folded the incredibly heavy renunciation exactly once and placed it gently on the wooden chapel bench. And then he quietly, intensely, asked the exact, highly unexpected question that totally, completely changed absolutely everything. Would Sophie absolutely still willingly advise him, if absolutely no aggressive, legal document, explicitly, forcefully compelled him to actively listen to her? For the absolute first time, the incredibly stressed future king completely wasn't frantically, heavily debating an aggressively inherited command. He was finally, truly, entirely making his own completely independent choice. Sophie quickly, quietly agreed, but she firmly, absolutely, set exactly one crucial, highly specific condition of her incredibly own. William absolutely had to promise that this entirely quiet, totally unwritten agreement would absolutely never, ever be aggressively treated as deep disloyalty to his father. And he also absolutely had to ensure Catherine would completely, truly, never again, intensely, terribly, feel forced to quietly, secretly, move highly classified documents entirely in secret just to actively make him hear an incredibly uncomfortable, totally undeniable truth. William completely, quietly accepted, explicitly deciding to entirely, voluntarily sign a massively revised, newly drafted accord, explicitly, voluntarily giving Sophie a highly important, entirely guaranteed 3-year council role, completely under his own, absolute, totally independent authority, rather than aggressively submitting to Charles's incredibly heavy-handed demand. The massive, deeply terrifying deadlock was absolutely, entirely over. The massive, highly stalled timetable could actively move again, but exactly by the time the highly relieved palace finally, publicly confirmed the massive coronation would absolutely proceed, Sophie's incredibly explosive revelation had already completely, entirely escaped absolutely every single boundary specifically, tightly designed to entirely contain it. The incredibly massive, deeply controversial story was absolutely no longer simply about an incredibly boring internal council seat. It had completely, entirely become a massive, highly public, totally undeniable test of William's absolute, fierce independence, Charles's deeply flawed judgment, and Sophie's incredibly unexpected, highly intense authority. Buckingham Palace moved incredibly, desperately quickly, and aggressively released a highly formal, totally sanitized statement, explicitly confirming that William had officially, voluntarily approved a massive, highly important 3-year continuity council, and that Sophie would officially serve as its absolute senior family member, entirely during the incredibly sensitive transition. The massive announcement absolutely mattered incredibly deeply, because it perfectly, undeniably proved William had absolutely not simply weakly accepted Charles's incredibly aggressive demand. He had entirely, brilliantly rewritten it completely under his own, absolute authority. Broadcasters intensely, highly publicly framed the incredibly massive settlement as both a highly complex compromise and a deeply serious warning. William had successfully, entirely protected his absolute independence, but he had also deeply, truly accepted that an entirely new reign could absolutely not ruthlessly, simply erase every single relationship that had heavily sustained the old one. Then, one incredibly massive front page, completely, absolutely captured the entire, deeply complex crisis, aggressively displaying an image of William firmly carrying the heavy accord, beneath the incredibly stark, totally unavoidable headline, "The Promise Before the Crown." Below it incredibly prominently appeared Sophie quietly arriving for the highly crucial chapel meeting, an incredibly striking image that aggressively spread incredibly quickly, because it perfectly, totally reduced weeks of absolute, massive private tension to exactly one highly brutal, intensely public question: had the prince truly chosen entirely freely, or had the entire, massive monarchy aggressively forced him to bend to their will? Massive crowds excitedly, intensely gathered exactly outside Windsor Castle, entirely when confirmation of the massive coronation was finally announced, and several people heavily applauded exactly as Sophie's car slowly passed entirely through the heavy gates, while incredibly others proudly held handwritten signs clearly reading, "Duty deserves a voice." Sophie had absolutely, entirely, never ever asked to become an incredibly massive public cause, yet the entire country had completely turned her intensely private, deeply agonizing sacrifice entirely into a massive national argument. She quietly, deeply watched the intense, unrelenting coverage beside Edward in a small, incredibly quiet sitting room, and completely, heavily lowered the volume when deeply hyperactive commentators aggressively called her the incredibly powerful woman who had explicitly, forcefully forced William's reluctant hand. Edward quietly, intensely reminded her that the absolute final accord completely carried the prince's total, free choice, completely not her intense pressure, but she deeply, intimately knew that incredibly rapid public judgment absolutely rarely, ever waits for incredibly quiet, entirely private truth. William absolutely, completely refused incredibly panicked advice to actively distance himself from Sophie, explicitly, fiercely insisting she heavily accompany him to the incredibly next massive transition engagement, actively making their intense, total unity incredibly visible, rather than merely quietly claimed in a boring press release. Charles then finally heavily signed the massive, totally necessary coronation approval memorandum, and quietly, totally removed his incredibly aggressive, completely original condition entirely from the highly classified official file. The incredibly tired king completely, fully understood exactly what had deeply changed. His newly empowered son had entirely turned an incredibly aggressive, highly imposed demand perfectly into a completely voluntary, highly mature promise. The massive timetable was completely, entirely restored. The intense, utterly terrifying argument was absolutely settled, but exactly one incredibly heavy, entirely final question massively remained. Who had truly, fundamentally, and absolutely prevailed in this intense, world-shifting conflict? The incredibly deep, fully satisfying answer isn't actually found exactly in who ultimately controlled the piece of paper, but entirely in exactly what each incredibly stubborn person was finally, absolutely willing to entirely surrender. The incredibly toxic coronation condition actively began exactly as a deep, massive expression of pure fear. Charles deeply feared the absolute disappearance of necessary experience. William intensely feared deeply inheriting a highly restrictive reign, already aggressively controlled by massive promises he had absolutely not personally chosen. And Sophie intensely feared completely becoming vastly more important entirely, as a highly manipulative condition than she had absolutely ever wished to be simply as a trusted person. Yet the massive, highly terrifying crisis completely ended absolutely not through total victory or complete defeat, but entirely through three incredibly deep, highly respectful acts of pure surrender, absolutely each one allowing the massive monarchy to actively move forward, without completely, ruthlessly denying exactly what had deeply come before. William signed the heavily revised Coronation Continuity Accord, explicitly giving Sophie 3 highly important years on the absolute sovereign's inner council, completely with direct access during massive emergencies, meaning she would absolutely no longer incredibly serve completely through Charles's aggressive command, but she would highly officially remain because the absolute future king had completely chosen to trust her perfectly sound judgment. Charles then fully signed the incredibly massive final coronation approval and fully withdrew his incredibly aggressive original condition, fully accepting that necessary continuity had absolutely been perfectly protected, entirely without aggressively controlling his incredibly independent son's upcoming reign. William carried both highly important versions of the massive accord entirely into Charles's deeply quiet study, respectfully placed the heavily revised, newly signed document exactly beside the totally unsigned, deeply aggressive original, and quietly waited. The highly exhausted monarch slowly, intensely read his incredibly proud son's firm signature, then slowly removed the highly toxic, completely old condition, completely from the massive desk, and instead of formally sending it to the massive, highly secure official archive, he quietly, deliberately locked it entirely inside a highly private drawer. The intense, unmistakable message was completely absolute. The aggressive, outdated command permanently belonged to the past. Charles quietly, deeply told William that the incredible condition had absolutely never been deeply designed to aggressively question his absolute strength, but that he had deeply feared that incredibly pure strength, left totally unchallenged, could intensely, tragically become absolute isolation. The highly mature, fully prepared prince intensely answered with entirely equal honesty that absolutely pure trust could completely not be easily inherited, exactly like a heavy crown. It absolutely had to be genuinely offered completely before it could be truly, honestly returned. Sophie quietly, respectfully, entered the incredibly massive room exactly only entirely after the father and son had deeply, privately spoken, and William immediately, warmly invited her to physically sit exactly beside them rather than highly formally across the massive desk. That incredibly small, intensely beautiful choice, completely, entirely restored, exactly what the incredibly massive argument had absolutely, almost completely taken from her. She was absolutely, definitively, no longer the highly toxic, manipulated subject of a deeply contentious bargain entirely between two incredibly powerful men. She was fully, entirely, officially, a deeply respected part of the final settlement. Sophie had entirely, deeply remained perfectly silent, specifically because she absolutely, truly wanted William's highly important final decision to completely, undeniably belong to him alone. Her heavily documented account had entirely, absolutely not been explicitly intended to publicly expose Charles or aggressively force the future king into total submission. She firmly spoke only because the massive, incredibly toxic secrecy was completely, intensely poisoning their vital trust, and entirely pure silence had finally become completely, significantly more dangerous than the brutal, highly uncomfortable truth. No single, specific person totally, perfectly won. Charles seamlessly preserved vital continuity, William aggressively protected the total independence of his incredibly important reign, and Sophie perfectly gained something vastly, incredibly more meaningful than a forced title, a deeply guaranteed influence, and an incredibly high place entirely, explicitly granted entirely through massive respect completely, rather than highly toxic obligation. William absolutely became truly, entirely ready for the heavy crown completely before the incredibly massive coronation itself actually happened, beautifully learning that highly honest, challenging voices absolutely do not weaken deep authority. Charles deeply learned that a highly protective father absolutely must eventually completely release absolute control, and Sophie perfectly proved that entirely true. Deep loyalty is completely, totally willing to surrender massive power completely to perfectly preserve deep trust. When William finally walked completely toward his incredible, massive coronation, Sophie's highly visible place exactly beside the new reign was absolutely no longer Charles's aggressive condition. It was the incredibly secure, future king's absolute, totally voluntary promise, entirely freely made and completely, fully understood. And honestly, the absolute, incredible fact that the entire, massively complex thing nearly completely collapsed entirely before anyone ever even simply, truly, thought to genuinely, quietly, ask exactly what Sophie actually, deeply wanted, perfectly, tells you absolutely everything you need to know about exactly how incredibly tangled and toxic the entire royal dynamics had deeply become.